The candles in the east wing had been burning for 3 hours before anyone thought to ask why. Cecily Morrow stood at the far end of the gallery, one hand pressed flat to the paneled wall, and the other folded tight at her waist, and she listened to Thornfield Hall celebrate itself without her. The music drifted up from the ballroom below, in warm, indifferent waves. Someone had opened the terrace doors. She could hear the particular quality of laughter that belongs only to people who have never needed to count their candles, people for whom warmth is simply the condition of rooms, rather than something to be managed and rationed and grateful for. She had not been invited to the ball. She was the late Mr. Gante, Morrow's daughter, which is to say she was a woman who occupied rooms in this house by courtesy and nothing else. The courtesy being the long friendship between her father and the previous Lord Ashmore, a friendship that death had concluded before anyone had thought to put it on paper in a way that protected her. Her father had died 7 months ago, in the autumn, on a Tuesday, when the leaves had just begun to turn russet and gold along the east meadow boundary. What he had left behind was a modest annuity, a reputation for gentle incompetence in financial matters, a sheaf of letters tied with blue ribbon that she had not yet been able to read, and a corset. She had not known about the corset until 3 weeks after the funeral, when her maid Agnes had found it folded at the bottom of a cedar chest, and brought it to her with the careful expression of someone carrying an unexploded shell. Cecily had turned it over in her hands, bewildered by the weight of it. The boning was stiffer than it ought to have been, stiff with something more than the usual whalebone, and the lining was thick in an odd, deliberate way along the left side. Agnes had found the seam, the place where someone had taken very careful close stitches to close a slit that had been opened in the silk lining, and Cecily had worked a single finger inside and drawn out a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was her father's. She had read it, standing in her own room with the door locked and Agnes sent away on an errand. She had read it 3 more times since. Each time, certain she had misunderstood. She had not misunderstood. Now she stood in the gallery, while the Viscount of Ashmore held a ball in his dead father's house, and she tried to determine whether she was brave enough to go downstairs. The green dress she wore was her mother's, retrimmed twice with ribbon that did not quite match. She had done her own hair, because she had not wished to ask Agnes for help, and then be required to explain the reason for it. There was a small mirror at the end of the gallery, and she had looked at herself in it for a long moment before deciding that what she saw was sufficient for the purpose, which was not to be admired. The will was sewn into the corset. The instruction was sewn into the will. "Leave the hall before midnight," it said, in her father's careful, slightly trembling hand. She had spent 3 weeks trying to understand what he had meant by it, and why he had meant it as a warning rather than a prescription, a thing to be avoided rather than obeyed. The phrasing was, everything. He had not written go. He had written leave the hall before midnight, and the weight of the sentence was on the leaving, and she had eventually arrived at the understanding that he meant someone would try to ensure that she did. The current Lady Ashmore had said as much to her cousin last week in the morning room while Cecily was passing through the adjoining corridor. She had not been meant to hear it, which was perhaps why it had been said so clearly, in the tone of a woman who assumed the walls were on her side. "Poor Thomas's girl," Lady Ashmore had said. "No prospects, no beauty to speak of, and now she has the presumption to stay." And her cousin had said in the particular voice of a woman who prefers to agree rather than consider, "Well, one hopes she will see reason before the new year." And the dowager had said, "She will see reason. I will see to it that she does." Cecily had kept walking. She had gone to her room and stood at the window and looked out at the east meadow for a long time, at the 3 hawthorn trees along the far boundary, at the frost-gray grass, at the low English sky. She went downstairs at 11:30. The ballroom was everything she had anticipated, and nothing she was prepared for in her body. 300 candles in the chandelier threw light onto 300 shoulders, and she was wearing her retrimmed dress among women in white muslin and yellow silk, and a rival she had not yet met who stood near the dowager in ice blue with a composure so practiced it had become its own kind of statement. This was Miss Barwell, of Shropshire. Cecily did not know her name yet. She knew only that she was young and finished, and that the dowager held the young woman's arm with the proprietary satisfaction of someone displaying something she considers her own best work. She stood at the edge of the room for a moment and let her eyes move across it, looking for Mr. Peyton. He noticed her in less than 2 minutes. She understood only after the fact that the quality of sound near the far end of the room had changed, the way a room changes when someone in it goes very still, and that the stillness had corresponded to a place and the place had corresponded to a man. The Viscount of Ashmore was tall enough to be visible above most of the room, and he had been talking to a gentleman Cicely did not recognize, and then he had not been talking anymore. She felt the fact of his attention before she permitted herself to confirm it. She had spent 7 months not permitting herself anything with respect to the Viscount of Ashmore. She moved along the edge of the ballroom. She had come tonight for one reason, and one reason only, which was to find Mr. Spand, Peyton, the solicitor whose name her father had written at the end of his letter, the solicitor who has the rest of it, and do not leave the hall before you have spoken to him. She had seen the man from her window that afternoon, arriving in a plain carriage with a satchel, going in through the servants' entrance as if he did not wish to be observed. She had been watching for him since before the ball began. A woman in pink silk stepped back from a conversation and nearly knocked Cicely to the floor. Cicely steadied herself against a chairback, murmured an apology to no one in particular, and kept moving. "Miss Morrow." She stopped. The voice was low and level, and she had never heard it directed at her with that particular quality of intention, as if her name were something the speaker had been holding carefully and had now decided to set down in the correct place. She stood with her hand still on the chairback and turned. The Viscount of Ashmore had covered the distance from the far end of the room in the time it had taken her to steady herself, which was less time than it ought to have been for a man of his height navigating a crowded ballroom. He stood 2 feet from her, which was near enough to suggest purpose, and he was looking at her with the expression she had first seen in the churchyard, the expression she had catalogued as dismissal, and could not now be entirely certain was. His face was his father's structure with something else inhabiting it. The jaw, the breadth of forehead, the dark eyes. The something else was harder to name. It was the quality of a man who has spent a considerable portion of his life noticing things he did not discuss and has decided at some recent and unmarked point that the not discussing had become a habit he could no longer afford. "Your Grace," she said. It was wrong. Immediately, a viscount was not a duke, and she knew this, and the mistake announced itself the moment it left her mouth hanging in the 3 inches of air between them. "My lord," he said, not mockingly, simply as a correction offered between equals, which was generous of him. "I apologize, my lord. You are looking for someone," he said. Not a question. Again. She studied him for a moment, trying to determine the shape of the conversation he was proposing and whether she was in any position to decline it. "I have some small business to attend to," she said. "I will be brief." "I do not mean to impose on the evening." "Whose evening?" he said. She looked at him. "You were not on the invitation list," he said, and she prepared herself for what would follow. The polite extraction, the managed dismissal that the dowager had trained him to perform, and instead he said, "I noticed this when the list was presented to me. I considered remedying the omission, but then thought it more likely that you would prefer to come on your own terms rather than by formal invitation, if you came at all." She said nothing for a moment. "You've been thinking about my preferences," she said. "I have been paying attention," he said. "It is a more recent habit than it ought to be." He paused. "You are looking for Peyton." The warmth spread from her face to her throat. "He arrived this afternoon," he said. "He has been in the library since 8 o'clock. He told me you would come tonight and asked me to ensure no one prevented you from finding him. He let that land. He also told me that if you were not in the library by midnight, something your father had intended would be lost." She kept her hands still. "My lord," she said, "what exactly did the solicitor tell you?" "Enough," he said. "Come. I will take you to him." He did not offer his arm. He moved and she moved beside him, and she was aware without looking of the precise moment when the dowager's attention found them, of the brief interruption in the sound of Miss Barwell's careful conversation, of the fact that the Viscount of Ashmore was escorting a woman in a reed-trimmed green dress across his own ballroom, in full view of every person he had invited to witness him doing so. If you have ever wondered what it costs a woman to stay, when everyone in the room has decided that she should not stay with us a little longer, the library door is just ahead. In the corridor between the ballroom and the east wing, just past the turn where the portraits of earlier Ashmores hung in their gilded frames, he stopped. She stopped with him. The corridor was empty. A single candle burned in a bracket on the wall and threw its light across both of them unevenly, catching the line of his jaw, the dark of his coat, the pale of her retrimmed dress. "There is something I ought to tell you," he said, "before we reach Peyton, because once you have signed those papers you will have no particular reason to remain in this house, and I do not wish you to leave without knowing it." She waited. 7. He turned slightly, not toward her, not away. The careful angle of a man managing the distance between impulse and action. "My father came to me 3 years ago," he said, "in the last year of his good health, and told me he was worried about what would become of you after he was gone. He meant your father. He meant the friendship, what it would leave behind, whether there would be anything solid for you to stand on." He paused. "I told him I did not know you well enough to offer an opinion. He told me that was exactly the problem and that I ought to remedy it." "And did you?" she said. "No," he said. "I was in London for most of the following year, and when I came back, my father's health had changed, and I had other concerns, and I told myself there would be time." He was quiet for a moment. "There was not time. He died in February. Your father died in April. And I found myself in possession of an estate, a difficult mother, and the understanding that I had let 2 years pass when I might have been paying attention, and instead had been managing my affairs in London and telling myself that people who needed things would wait." She looked at him in the candlelight. "You are carrying that," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am not telling you so that you will absolve me of it. I am telling you so that you understand why I am trying now to be different about paying attention." He met her eyes. "My father kept a miniature of your father on his writing desk. I found it when I was clearing his study. A small thing painted on ivory, the two of them, when they were young men. Your father is laughing in it. My father has his hand on his shoulder. And he is laughing too." His voice was very level. I had never seen my father laugh like that. Not in my memory. I was born after whatever lightness produced. That moment had already been spent, and I did not know until I found the miniature how much he had carried, all those years. The weight of what the estate required him to be. She thought of her own father, the careful stitches, the trembling hands. They were keeping each other. She said. "Yes," he said. "And now they are not, and here we are in this corridor. And I thought you ought to know that the miniature is on my desk now. I did not put it away." She looked at him for a long moment, long enough to understand that the miniature on his desk was not a small thing, and that he knew it was not a small thing and had told her so anyway, which was its own kind of courage in a man who was not accustomed to uncovering himself. "Shall we go?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Come." They walked the rest of the corridor together, and neither of them spoke, and the candle behind them went out in a draught, and they did not notice because the library was ahead, and the clock on the mantel was counting toward midnight. The library at Thornfield Hall smelled of leather bindings and old ash in the grate, and the dry stillness of rooms where consequential things have been decided by people who could afford to be patient. The solicitor rose when they entered. He was a small man with very precise hands, and the expression of someone who has been carrying a significant weight across a long distance and is genuinely relieved to set it down in the correct place. "Miss Morrow," he said, "I am glad you found your way here." "My father's letter," she said. She produced it from the small bag at her wrist. The paper had gone soft at the folds from the number of times she had opened and refolded it, but her father's handwriting was still clear. the careful, slightly forward-leaning script of a man who had been taught penmanship before he had been taught anything else. He told me to find you before midnight. He told me to bring this. The solicitor looked at the Viscount with a small, confirming nod. Your father came to me in September, the solicitor said, in the last week of his illness. He could not make the journey into the village, so I came here twice, and we worked out the arrangement between us over 2 long afternoons. He was very particular about the stitching on the corset. He did it himself. He said he did not wish to involve anyone in the household in what he was putting inside it. He sewed it himself, Cecily said. He was, he told me, a competent seamster from his youth. He said it was one of the few skills his mother had been insistent about. The solicitor allowed himself a small expression of something almost like tenderness. He was very particular about a great many things, your father. He wanted to be certain you would find it. He told me you never discarded anything that had belonged to your mother. She looked down at the desk for a moment. He had been right about what careful things can do when they are given enough time. She had kept the cedar chest because the cedar chest had been her mother's. She had kept the corset because it had been folded inside the cedar chest, and she had not yet been ready to go through the rest. He had known this about her, had planned around it, had trusted her past grief to carry his message forward into a future he would not be present for. The document inside the corset, the solicitor continued, setting his hands flat on the desk, is in the nature of a codicil to a private agreement made some years ago between your father and the late Lord Ashmore, this gentleman's father. He glanced at the Viscount. The 2 men were friends for 40 years, the Viscount said. I knew this. I did not know the specifics of what they had arranged between them until Peyton came to me in August. In the spring of 1809, the solicitor said, your father lent the late his father a sum of money. It was considerable relative to your father's income. The estate was under some pressure at the time. The old lord's elder brother had died the previous autumn and left complications, and your father offered the loan without condition. The old lord was too proud to accept it as a gift, and too sensible to accept it as a simple debt, and so they arranged something more formal. The 60 acres of East Meadow, legally deeded from the Ashmore estate to your father, in trust with the provision that the land would come to you upon your father's death. It was witnessed and signed and deposited with my firm in 1809. Cecily looked at him. The East Meadow, she said. The boundary marked by 3 hawthorns, the Viscount said quietly. My father planted them in 1809, the same spring the agreement was signed. I know this because the planting records are in the estate books, and because he told me once that they had been planted to mark something he considered permanent. He paused. I did not understand what he meant until August. She turned to look at the window, which was dark with the November night. 60 acres. She had looked at those acres every morning from her window. She had walked the boundary of them without knowing she was walking the boundary of anything, and all the time they had been hers, deeded and signed and waiting, and someone in this house had known it and said nothing. The dowager, she said. She suspected the existence of a document, the Viscount said. His voice was level in the way that conceals effort. She did not know where it was. My father was very private about the arrangement. He told her only that there was a private understanding with your father, and that she need not concern herself with it. She was not by nature a woman who accepted that instruction without working to determine what lay behind it. He paused again. When your father died and you remained in the hall, she began making inquiries. She found nothing in my father's papers, because he had lodged everything with Peyton. She found nothing in your father's rooms, because he had taken the corset to her yourself and placed it in the cedar chest in your room. She has been managing the East Meadow accounts as if it were estate property, Cecily said. Yes, the solicitor said. The discrepancy came to my attention in August. I went to the Viscount directly. He was, I am glad to say, not surprised that his father had made such an arrangement and was fully prepared to honor it. She looked at the Viscount. Not surprised, she said. My father spoke of yours often, he said. He spoke of you as well. He told me things about you over several years, small things the kind of things a man observes about someone he respects and wishes his son to respect. Also, I did not, at the time, understand why he was telling me. I understand now. She held his gaze for a moment, and then looked back at the desk. "What do I need to sign?" she said to the solicitor. "These papers," he said, "will formally transfer the deed from the trust arrangement to your direct name, with clear legal standing that removes any ambiguity about what the private agreement of 1809 intended." He set them in front of her. Your father anticipated a challenge. He was thorough. He also wrote in the codicil inside the corset a full account of the loan, the terms, and the 1809 agreement, in his own hand, witnessed at the time by two men who are still living. If the dowager were to contest the transfer, she would find herself contesting the testimony of two elderly gentlemen who take considerable pride in their witness signatures and would not receive the suggestion that their testimony was insufficient. There was, she thought, something deeply characteristic about her father. In all of this, the hidden stitches, the long patience, the thorough preparation for the challenge that might come. He had always moved slowly and carefully and trusted that careful things survived. She signed where the solicitor indicated. Her hand was steady. She had not been certain it would be. When it was done, the clock on the mantel read 4 minutes to midnight. The solicitor gathered his papers with the efficient quiet of a man who has just completed the work he was assembled to complete, and he excused himself with the tact of someone who understands that his presence is no longer the most important thing in the room. The door closed. The fire settled. She was alone with the Viscount, and the smell of old books, and the weight of what had just been put in order. She looked at the desk for a moment, at the pen she had used, and the place where her name now lived in ink on paper that would be filed, and registered, and kept. And she thought of the distance between the woman who had stood in the gallery 3 hours ago listening to the ballroom, and the woman who was now standing in the library of the same house with 60 acres of East Meadow, formally and irrevocably hers. The distance was the same rooms. The distance was these hours. The distance was a set of careful stitches her father had made in September with his trembling hands. She was not yet accustomed to being a woman. With ground beneath her feet, she thought it might take some time to learn the weight of it. "I owe you an apology," he said. He was standing by the fireplace, with his hands at his sides, his coat dark against the warm light of the coals, and he looked like a man who had been composing a sentence for some time and had finally decided to say it aloud. "I looked away from you at my father's funeral. I have thought about it a great many times since, and I have not been able to produce a satisfactory account of myself. You owe me nothing," she said. "You countermanded your mother's instruction about my rooms. You brought me here tonight. You told me about the letter before I had to ask for it. Those are things I ought to have done," he said. "They do not cancel what I failed to do earlier. I am not in the habit of crediting myself for meeting a minimum." She regarded him. She was beginning to understand that his severity with himself was the same quality that expressed itself as discipline in the management of the estate, and patience in the management of the tenants, and the very careful, deliberate attention he had been giving to everything she said for 7 months. It was not coldness. It was a man who held things to a standard, and was not willing to make exceptions for himself. "I turned away at the funeral," he said, "because I could not look at you without something I did not yet know how to manage. My father had spoken of you for years in the way he spoke of things he valued, which is to say, quietly and precisely and without sentiment. When you stood in the churchyard, I looked at you and understood for the first time what he had been telling me. And the understanding arrived too late and too sudden, and I did not know what to do with it." She looked at him. The firelight made his face different than the ballroom had, less composed, more present. "You turned away from grief," she said. "Yes," he said, "which was cowardly. I am sorry for it." "It was human," she said, which was not forgiveness precisely, but was, she thought, more accurate, and accuracy was the currency she preferred. He looked at her for a moment. "My father wrote to me 6 weeks before he died," he said. "He asked me to pay attention. He said it simply. In those words, Pay attention, Edmund. I did not know until tonight what he meant me to pay attention to, although I think I had known for some months before tonight, and had been unwilling to say so. She considered this. And have you, she said, been paying attention? I have been trying, he said. With increasing seriousness. The clock struck midnight, and neither of them moved toward the door. In the morning, the dowager would find the copies of the signed documents that the solicitor left on the library desk, as was proper and procedurally correct. She would sit with them for a long time in the sitting room, her fan still in her hands, her expression arranged into its customary composure, and she would understand that what she had been maneuvering against had already concluded without her. She was not a cruel woman, in the way of women who enjoy cruelty. She was a woman whose certainty about the shape of the world had been organized around a specific understanding of who counted and who did not. And Cecily Morrow had fallen, in that understanding, firmly into the category of those who did not. This was not personal malice. It was something worse, which was structural confidence. The assurance of a woman who has never been wrong about such things before, and has not developed the habit of second-guessing herself. She would need some time. The dowager. She was not without intelligence. She would use the time. Well, the young woman from Shropshire of Shropshire, the young woman in ice blue, who had been waiting in the ballroom for the Viscount to return and complete what the dowager had arranged to be the natural conclusion of the evening, departed at 12:30 in excellent spirits. She was more sensible than the situation had credited her. She had come with expectations, but not with illusions, and illusions are the only truly expensive thing to lose. She sent a very correct letter 3 days later and received a very correct reply, and within the month she had attached herself to a baronet in Derbyshire with considerably more warmth than the Viscount had ever offered her, and she was, by all accounts, well satisfied. The solicitor drove home on the Thornfield Road in the cold of the midnight air, and allowed himself a glass of brandy when he arrived, and the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who has done what he was put here to do. Cecily walked the East Meadow for the first time on the morning of December the 10th, when frost still lay along the hedgerow in long silver lines, and the light came thin and golden across 60 acres of grass that were now hers in law, and not merely in the stitched secret of a cedar chest. She wore the green dress and her warmest mantle, and she was not, for the first time in 7 months, attempting to make herself smaller than the space around her. He met her at the stile. He had not told her he would be there. He was simply there, as he had been in the library, with the quality of a man who has made a decision and considers it made and acts accordingly. He had come from the direction of the stables, she thought, from the set of his coat, and he had been there for some time before she arrived, which she deduced from the way he was not looking toward the house for her arrival but already standing easy, as if the meadow had been his destination and she was simply a pleasant addition to a walk. He had been taking anyway. She understood this as courtesy of a particular kind. He was not making her arrival into an occasion. He was simply there, and she was simply there, and they walked. The far boundary is marked by 3 hawthorns, he said, falling into step beside her. My father planted them in the spring of 1809. He told me once, when I was perhaps 12 years old, that they were the most reliable things on the estate. He did not elaborate. He was not a man who elaborated. She looked at him. He told me the hawthorns were reliable, and you inferred that he meant I was reliable, she said. I made an inference, he agreed. I make many inferences. Some of them are more defensible than others. The expression that was not quite a smile. Come, the drainage wants attention before the spring, and I thought you ought to see it. She walked beside him through the frost-heavy grass, and she felt, very specifically, the weight of ground beneath her feet. There are women the world decides not to count, and there are men who have good fathers, and the combination of the two is not a story the world tells often enough. If this one has stayed with you, leave a thought in the comments. That afternoon they sat in the small sitting room off the library with 2 cups of tea going cold between them, and she showed him the corset from the cedar chest, the place where the stitches had been, Agnes's careful opening of the seam, the soft paper that had been inside. He held it for a moment and looked at the weight of it. He must have been frightened, he said finally. To go to such lengths, to put it into your hands this way, rather than simply telling you. He was always frightened, she said. He spent his whole life a little frightened. He was not a bold man. He was a careful man, which is different, and in some ways harder, because a bold man can rely on the moment, but a careful man has to rely on himself. She looked at the corset in his hands. He put it where he knew I would keep it. He trusted my grief to carry his message forward. That is the kind of man he was. The Viscount of Ashmore looked at her across the table. I would like, he said carefully, in the manner of a man who has prepared the sentence and then doubted it, and then concluded that the doubt was the thing to be overcome, to make an arrangement of a different character than the one my father and yours made. An arrangement, she said. A formal one, he said. A courtship. Properly conducted, with your full understanding of what I am proposing, and the knowledge that I am not doing so out of obligation to either of our fathers, or convenience to the estate, or any other reason, except that I have been paying attention since August and I am not able to stop. She held his gaze. She thought of the churchyard. 7 months ago, the cold air and the gray sky and his face turning away. She thought of the east wing candles and the sound of the ballroom. She thought of the morning room and the dowager's voice saying no beauty to speak of, as if beauty were the only currency that purchased the right to remain. She thought of her father bent over a sewing frame in September with his trembling hands, working the careful stitches, believing she was worth the trouble of it. You may call on me tomorrow, she said. In this room, with the door open. He let out a breath. Very quiet. Tomorrow, he said. Yes. They did not rush the months that followed. December passed in formal calls and cold walks along the east meadow boundary, the hawthorns bare against the gray sky, their branches holding the frost in long silver lines. January was the sitting room, and the tea that was always going cold, and conversations that went longer than either of them planned. February brought the dowager to the dinner table with Cecily placed beside her, which was not warmth, and was not friendship, but was acknowledgment, which has a longer life than either. In March, when the hawthorns came into their first pale leaf, there was a knock at the door of her room in the early afternoon, and Agnes opened it with the expression of someone managing her face with more effort than usual. And he was standing in the corridor with his hat in his hands, and his expression unguarded in a way she had not seen before in any room where they were not entirely alone. I have been trying to compose something measured, he said from the doorway. I have spent 3 days on it, and I have not succeeded. I thought you ought to know that the failure is not from insufficient effort. She waited. Cecily, he said. Her name in his voice, the first time. It landed with the weight of something her father had written, something carefully preserved across time and given over, now fully, into the present. I am asking you to marry me, he said. Not from obligation or arrangement or the long friendship of our fathers, though I honor all of those things. I am asking you because I have been paying attention for 7 months, and the attention has become a permanent condition, and I do not wish to manage it privately any longer. She held his gaze for a moment that stretched out long enough for her to understand, in her chest and her hands, and the particular warmth behind her sternum, that the thing she was feeling was real and was permitted. Yes, she said. I am willing. He crossed the threshold and took her hand in both of his, and she felt his warmth, and the steadiness of his grip, and the fact that he held her hand as if it were something he intended to continue holding, not a gesture but a decision made permanent. They were married in May, small and warm, the church in the village with the gray stone walls, and the box pews that smelled of old oak and beeswax, the hawthorns in full flower along the east meadow boundary visible through the south window as she stood at the altar. Agnes wept quietly in the second row, with what she maintained afterward was a cold in both eyes simultaneously, which was unlikely, but not a point worth pressing. That evening, the first evening, in rooms that were hers without arrangement or sufferance, or the managed courtesy of anyone's goodwill, Cecily sat at the small writing desk near the window and wrote a letter to Agnes, giving her Tuesdays, and heard him in the corridor. She turned toward the sound without bracing herself, which was new in her body. The turning, without defense, and he came in and stood behind her and looked over her shoulder. "Agnes," he read. "She will be very pleased." "She deserves more than Tuesdays," Cecily said. "I am starting with Tuesdays." He made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, low and quiet and briefly uncontained, and she heard in it the man her father had described, the man his father had tried to tell her about in planting records and hawthorn trees and careful letters. And she thought that perhaps love is often this, a thing you have been walking past without knowing what it is, patient in the ground, flowering every year for years and years, waiting only for someone to stop and look. She set down her pen. He set his hand on her shoulder, warm and certain, and she let herself rest in it, in the new rooms, in the May evening, in the life that had been stitched into the lining of things all along. She would bring out the cedar chest in the morning. She would set it at the foot of the wardrobe in the new rooms. The cedar smell of it was her father's presence, and she wanted him close, in this new place, and she thought he would not mind. The hawthorns at the far boundary of the east meadow stood in the last of the evening light, 3 small certain shapes against the spring sky, planted in 1809 by a man who believed that what he did carefully would outlast him. He had been right about what careful things can do when they are given enough time. Thank you for staying until the end. If Cecily's story reached you, leave a comment below with what you would have done with the corset. We read every one.